Միչիգանի համալսարանի պրոֆեսոր Ռոնալդ Սյունին ժամանակին շատ է քննադատվել Սփյուռքի եւ Հայաստանի պատմաբանների կողմից հայոց պատմության որոշ դրվագներ ոչ ավանդական ձևով ներկայացնելու եւ վերլուծելու համար։ Այսօր նրա հետ մենք հիմնականում խոսելու ենք մեր նորագույն պատմության 2020 թվականի պատերազմի եւ դրան հաջորդած իրադարձությունների մասին։ Իսկ 35 տարի առաջ 1989 թվականին Երևանում բացվեց մետրոյի Զորավար Անդրանիկ կայարանը։ Այն եզակի էր նրանով, որ կառուցվել էր եւ շահագործման էր հանձնվել գործող մետրոյի պայմաններում առանց խանգարելու մնացած 8 կայարանների աշխատանքին։ 35 տարի անց Երևանի մետրոպոլիտենի QR ուղղետոմսեր կարող եք գնել Telcel ընկերության Telcel Wallet հավելվածում, իսկ մինչև հուլիսի 20-ը դրան գնելով կմասնակցեք 10 միլիոն դրամի խաղարկությանը, բոլոր մանրամասները հասանելի են Telcel Wallet հավելվածում։ So I would like to start from quoting the headline of your article that appeared on the conversation in early October of 2023, just after 2 weeks after the Artsakh was gone. So it was called "Death of the Armenian Dream in Nagorno-Karabakh was predictable but not inevitable." Why was it predictable and why not inevitable?
The defeat in Artsakh and the ethnic cleansing of that area by the Azerbaijanis was something that Armenia could have predicted, could have understood. Think of what was happening during the long period that Armenians were in control of Karabakh and surrounding areas in Azerbaijan. Armenia was somewhat content with what it had achieved by 1994. It was, I think, resting on its laurels, as we say, and was not carefully calculating that in those 20 plus years, Azerbaijan was getting richer and militarizing itself, and that its major point of anger was to recover Karabakh, right? And Azerbaijan had formed a somewhat stable, authoritarian and repressive regime that required conflict. That such a regime, which is non-democratic, needed to be able to mobilize its population in order to keep the Aliyev family, this sultanate in Azerbaijan, in power. And Armenians were not being careful about that. And it seems to me there was a little bit too much hubris, a little bit too much satisfaction, too much pride in the achievement of the Armenians, and not great enough a sense of the danger that they would soon confront. So I think it was predictable in that sense. And obviously for an Armenian, incredibly regrettable. This is one of the greatest defeats in Armenian history. Imagine a place where Armenians had lived for thousands and thousands of years has now been removed. It's not as great a tragedy as the loss of Western Armenia, historic Armenia, that's now in Turkey, but it's significant in the 20th and 21st century.
And coming back to this headline, do you think that maybe one of the main issues was that this Armenian dream lacked a clear definition? So what was it?
Now, you'll forgive me, I will soon be unpopular with Armenians when I explain this. I think countries have to be careful, especially small countries, but even large countries like Russia and the United States, of what might be called imperial overreach, trying to do more than their own military and economic and manpower capacity allows. And Armenia was in fact involved in what I would call imperial overreach. It actually imagined that it could hold Karabakh, and not only Karabakh, but lands around Karabakh, Kalbajar and Lachin and so forth as well, for years and years without basically compromising, that it could settle those areas and keep a greater Armenia intact. And that was greater than Armenia was capable of. I think there were some fantastical dreams among Armenians that they could be like a new Israel, right? Well, we see what has happened in Israel. Constant conflict. They are now committing genocide in Gaza. You know, these kinds of things are the result of such imperialistic policies. And there was very little capacity or interest for many years in compromise. I remember when I came here in the late 90s, and I mentioned the word compromise, that was anathema. that was not a word that anyone wanted to talk about at that time. And this was still the Ter-Petrosyan years. And we know that when Ter-Petrosyan decided he would maybe make a few concessions, he was overthrown in what we call a constitutional coup. So I think it was that kind of imperial overreach that ultimately was what caused the defeat of Armenians.
I think maybe it's probably too late to talk about this, but when we talk about compromise, so if we talk about our Armenian possible compromises, it's obvious. So we should give back the region surrounding of Artsakh and having something in return. So what was this? Having something in return, because if we look at what Azerbaijanis were saying for decades, so the only thing that they will agree to give us, it was like the highest possible level of autonomy, and that's it.
Yeah.
So could we assess that as a compromise?
So the problem with compromise is you have to have both sides ready to compromise. And
True.
I'm not sure Armenia was ready to compromise, and I'm not sure Azerbaijan was ready to compromise, right? But the problem was that one had to sit down and begin to talk about whether you could trade some land for some idea of a compromise. Many years ago, I and a very important political scientist, David Layton, wrote an article about what we thought might be a way out of this conflict. But it was not well received and it was sort of disregarded. And we talked about something like this. This is all a dream now, none of this is possible. But we talked about having de facto self-rule in Artsakh by Armenians, by the majority. And there would be compromises. Azerbaijanis would be allowed to return those who had left, about 25% of the population. And de facto, Armenians would have this autonomous region that would be guaranteed internationally and by Armenia. But de jure, by international law, Artsakh would remain, as it is recognized by international law, within the sovereign boundaries of Azerbaijan. So there might be a flag, Azerbaijani flag, over the city hall in Stepanakert, something like that. And we had a very elaborate plan. I can't remember all the details. It's already, almost 30 years ago that we wrote the article. But those kinds of suggestions were made. And by the way, also by Ter-Petrosyan, there was some attempts at some kind of adjustment. None of those were taken very seriously. And ultimately, catastrophe occurred.
Your article says war sobers people, they are forced to face hard facts. But do you see something like that happening in Armenia today? Because I don't see.
You don't see what?
That war sobers people and that people are ready to face hard facts. I mean decision makers, politicians.
Yeah.
Because when we look at what is happening, like during these 4 years that passed since the war, like current leaders are blaming their predecessors, those ones are blaming the current ones, and there is no much talk about how this happened. So it's all about who we have to blame for what happened.
Yes. Well, first of all, if you're defeated in a war, that has serious consequences, right? So Armenia, which is a very small state facing a more powerful Azerbaijan, which has powerful allies, namely Turkey and even to some degree Israel, and it has been betrayed by its longtime ally, Russia, which is busy elsewhere in the mud of Ukraine. And Armenia itself now is left largely defenseless. It has to compromise. It has to deal with the hard, tragic facts of the loss of Artsakh, which has to be recognized as gone, at least for our lifetime and well into the future, and with its own weakness. And therefore, it must make concessions. These are hard. I'm not going to suggest to the Armenian government what it has to do, but it seems to me that the Pashinyan government is thinking along those lines, that it is understanding that there might have to be changes in the constitution. There will be changes in the border. There will be serious discussions about some kind of corridor, those kinds of things. And Azerbaijan also has to think about what it's willing to accept in the long term. And it's playing, because it has the victory in its hands, it's playing a very hard game, right? And it's holding Armenian leaders and others as prisoners in Baku under very cruel conditions. So, it's not easy for Armenians to accept all of this. Why? because Azerbaijan has been a state that, in fact, has harbored murderers who killed Armenians in Budapest. We can remember these things, who have been very vicious towards Armenians, who essentially allowed hundreds of thousands of Armenians to be forced out of Azerbaijan. Imagine, there was a moment when Gorbachev was visiting Armenia after the earthquake, when he pointed out that there are more Armenians in Baku and Sumgait and other towns in Azerbaijan than there even are in Karabakh. But there was a lot of emotion and nationalism developed about getting Karabakh back inside Armenia. And ultimately, it turned into what I consider a tragedy.
Yeah, as you said a few moments ago, Aliyev's regime needs this enemy to preserve its regime as it is.
Constant conflict it needs,
Yeah.
which is dangerous for Armenia.
And do you think that in these conditions he will be ready to sign this peace agreement? Because after the peace agreement is signed, there is no enemy at all. I don't say that there will be everything very good right after they sign it, but I mean the term of the enemy should disappear.
I agree completely. He'll have to find another enemy, and Armenians are the most convenient and the easiest. You know, if he takes on Iran, he also has serious claims about Iran. 2/3 of the Azerbaijani people live in Iran under different conditions. So, but that's a big game to play, and I'm not sure that his Turkish allies will go along with that. So, the funny thing is that Armenians as victims and as a source of conflict are very good for the Aliyev clan that rules Azerbaijan. And so it's going to be very difficult to do that. Hopefully, the West, hopefully the United States, which hasn't done a good thing for Armenia in a long time, very little. Think about, a repressive dictatorship launched a war, carried out ethnic cleansing from Artsakh, and a democracy was defeated. And what have the Americans done? They're fighting a war in Ukraine, they claim, to preserve democracy against a repressive dictatorship, namely Russia, that expanded and invaded Ukraine. Are there any American sanctions against Baku? No.
No.
Right? So, this puts the lie to the morality of the American position. Armenia is in a very difficult position. It's lost its major ally, which is, there's a great hostility, understandably, between Armenia and Russia at the moment. Something has to be done to change that. What I was very impressed with in the time I've been in Armenia lately is how generously and magnanimously Armenians here are receiving Russians. Russians like coming here. They're not received as well in Georgia, obviously. And yet Russians should also be seen and are seen as a power that has betrayed Armenia, right? So it seems to me if that kind of generosity, and if Pashinyan is deft enough, able enough, subtle enough to repair the relations with Putin and with Russia, this would be a very good thing.
Recently, I had a chance to talk to Edward Jerijan, one of the most distinguished U.S. diplomats, and I would like to quote him. Given what we saw and what happened to Artsakh, Armenia has to build up its defense capabilities and not to become a country that is seeking any external enemies, but to become strong enough internally that anyone who wants to take military action against Armenia has to think at least twice. Do you agree with that? And do you think this is possible to do?
That's very wise. Ambassador Derejan is a very wise man. I had the privilege once of appearing with him here in Yerevan many years ago. And this is clearly a man who has been around, as we say. He's experienced. He's a diplomat. He's also an Armenian. And like all Armenians, is patriotic and wants the best for our little country here. So I think that's very wise. This is a difficult moment. And it takes skills, and Armenians can find those skills. What's been the history of Armenia? I'm a historian, Batmabanim, So what is the history? We have stood between empires. Empires have tried to crush and eliminate Armenia. We have suffered a genocide just 105 years ago. And Armenians are still here. There are people that don't give up. There are people that have enormous resilience. You walk through the streets of Yerevan, people are still living, shopping, going to cafes, thinking. We have a very lively civil society here, right? Okay, it's divided. They're pro-Pashinyan, anti-Pashinyan, left, right, etc. But the debate goes on, and that's very, very powerful. It's powerful because our enemy, Azerbaijan, has crushed civil society. It's about a state ruled by a clan that has to keep its coercive forces on the population. And as I said before, has to maintain conflict over time. Armenia is much, in other words, Armenia is the most stable, it will sound strange to say that now, democracy in the South Caucasus. You see what's going on in Georgia as well. There are thousands and thousands of people in the street who don't like the Ivanishvili-backed government. So Armenia has a lot of political capital and international capital even that it can use. Now, at the moment, people are involved with other things. There's the Ukraine war, which is draining everything, resources of the EU and of the United States and of Russia, and people are dying for no good reason. Totally unnecessary war. A war of Putin's choice, not of necessity. But that war will end soon. And maybe if I were to give it any advice to the Pashinyan government, I'd say work hard. Yeah, gamats, but keep working in order to get Russia back into a less hostile relationship with Yerevan.
And do you think that building this deterrence is possible without becoming heavily dependent on any other foreign actor?
Foreign aid will probably be important in a variety of ways, and we have some from France, for instance, and there's arms deals with India and so forth. There's a policy that the United States and others have adopted toward Taiwan. So Taiwan is a democratic state that feels threatened by China and is indeed occasionally threatened by China if it moves toward greater independence. And the idea is that you strengthen Taiwan. You make it into what they call a porcupine, so that, yes, China may attack Taiwan. If it attacks Taiwan, it will suffer a great deal. So Armenia has to unify and become stronger militarily and obviously economically. There are some people even who think the loss of Artsakh, as tragic and terrible as it was, does provide an opportunity for a Armenia within the boundaries of the Soviet boundaries that it inherited to become a stronger, more stable, solidly democratic state, which will be a kind of beacon, a kind of lighthouse, showing the area, as an example, Georgia and Azerbaijan, what can be achieved, right, without conflict, with greater stability. I am a person of the left politically. That means I'm always optimistic and hopeful because I believe we can depend, even under difficult conditions, under the best instincts and of human beings.
By the way, it's interesting that Ambassador Jerejan also used this porcupine analogy for Armenia.
I'm in good company then. I'm in very good company.
Yeah. And I think another issue is that many people do not understand that the essence of the international relations has changed. And there are many players like Azerbaijan who are not superpowers, but they are still strong enough or became strong enough to be able to say no to great powers.
That's
mean,
right.
for example, like 20 years ago, if US Secretary of State was calling Azerbaijani president asking for something, you could think that it would be done. Today, this is not the case. And we
Right.
see it like maybe each 2 months, Secretary Blinken is calling to Aliyev and saying something, but nothing is taking place.
Yeah.
So in these circumstances, do you think that Armenia still is capable of finding its place?
Smaller countries, especially ones that have suffered defeat, have to be very realistic, cool, and almost Machiavellian about what they can achieve and what they can't achieve. And that kind of realism is important. And I have a sense, even though in many ways the Pashinyan government has made mistakes and sometimes talks too much about this or that and doesn't think carefully about some of its moves, I think its general direction of understanding that having been defeated, we have to make some concessions and solidify ourselves and think about being friendly with as many powers around us as possible. I even heard from someone while I was here this week that the one of the crossing places between Armenia and Turkey, right, which we hope will be open sometime, on the Armenian side has been refurbished, cleaned up, gotten ready. Now that to me is a very hopeful sign, right? That's a gesture towards Turkey. Look, we're ready to do this. You know, people in Kars, once an Armenian city, right? Kars goes back to the Middle Ages. People in Kars want that border open. The Kars vilayet is the poorest vilayet province in Turkey. And they want trade with Armenia. And such a thing would be great for the economies of Eastern Turkey, historic Armenia, and Armenia itself. So there are objective, economic, rational advantages to opening up the borders, right? And because we no longer have Karabakh, maybe the Turks can think that, well, okay, we don't have to be so bound to this issue of Karabakh and aiding Azerbaijan. We can now think a little bit more independently about improving our relations with Armenia, which then gives us greater credibility as a stable and progressive power vis-a-vis Europe and the United States.
You mentioned Kars. It's interesting. Two days ago, there was a news that there was a discussion or conference in Kars about Azerbaijani's right to return to Western Azerbaijan. And the mayor of Kars was the main speaker, and he was saying that today's Armenia is what is Western Azerbaijan. So maybe
really?
poor people in Kars want better relations, but not the government.
Not the
But
government.
I want to ask you, don't you think that Ilham Aliyev is still able to veto any decision that Turkey wants to make regarding relations with Armenia?
You know, you already indicated, and I think correctly, that even small powers like Azerbaijan can thwart the desires of great powers, right? I mean, in the United States, we have a government which is the most powerful government in the world, in the richest country in the world, and we have we supply great numbers of arms to Israel, and yet Israel says, goodbye, we're not going to do what you want. You want us to stop the war in Gaza, we're not going to do it. We're going to keep bombing. And the U.S. says, oh, well, we're not going to give you the big bombs. The U.S. gave them 2,000-pound bombs, which they decimated, and they committed a genocide, basically, in Gaza. And Israel decides, no, it will go its own way, and it's a sovereign state. And so why wouldn't Azerbaijan also, if it wants, if it doesn't need immediately the Bayraktar drones and so forth from Turkey, why wouldn't it act independently? So, you know, it's a funny thing. I could imagine a scenario in which Ankara is a brake on Baku, in which it tries to keep Baku from starting and accelerating conflicts with Armenia. Why would Ankara need more conflict after the loss of Karabakh? Why would it need it with Azerbaijan? But as I mentioned, unfortunately for us, Azerbaijan needs conflict, you know, needs some kind of reason to mobilize people in support of this repressive regime.
Yeah. As Armenia is going through hard times now, there are conflicting approaches. Like some advocate for forgetting the past and focusing on the future. The others are saying that you cannot build future without having your past. Do you think that there is some possibility to find a middle ground between these two approaches? As a historian.
Yeah, I'm a historian, and for 13 years more, I've taught Armenian history, and I've written books on Armenian history. Sometimes I think Armenians are overburdened by history. We have too much history, and much of it is tragic. And we focus on those things, like, of course, on the genocide. You can't stop thinking about what happened to Armenia and the lands it lost, etc., right? So we're burdened, as I would put it, by our history. On the other hand, you can't forget it. That is, it is that history that has formed the identity of Armenians, the way they look at the world, the way they understand their interests, the emotions they feel on the 24th of April or many other times, the way they thought about Karabakh, Karabakh was the last wall between Armenia and a possible genocide in the future. The Azerbaijanis were called Turks, not Azerbaijanis. So, in other words, you can't get away from history. But history is not made of stone. It's not carved on the side of a mountain. History is malleable. It is flexible. You can imagine histories in different ways, not falsifying them. Maybe nationalists need false histories about always how heroic we are. But real historians and people don't need false histories. They need true, objective histories that tell them really what our problems are, what our faults are, what mistakes we made, and how we can do better, right? That's what real history is about. Now, that kind of history is often considered dangerous. I try to write that kind of history as best I can. And then when I wrote such things or talked about Karabakh or the genocide, I was called Davajan, Sunni Davajana, and criticized precisely for that. Okay, that's changed over time. Now, a younger generation, is interested, Nor Serunda, are much more interested in real objective history that can help us understand where we were, where we've come from, where we are, and what possible outlooks, what possible avenues we have toward a better future. So I would say you can't get rid of history, but you can think differently about history, and you can use it in a way to help you move forward in the future.
Yeah, and in this regard, I would like to mention your book, The History of the Armenian Genocide. They can live in the desert but now where else, which is a quotation from Talat Pasha. And you told when the book appeared that I have been told that it is not necessary to try to explain the genocide because this can lead to rationalization and even justification of what the Ottomans did to Armenians. So you've heard this in Diaspora.
Yes.
And so some 2 years ago, your book was published here by Magarat Publishing House and translated
I was
by
so happy
Maria
about that.
Sadoyan.
I thought that
and
was wonderful.
The question is, have you received any feedback from the Armenian edition of your book, positive, negative, or when it's like 2 years already? It was in fall of 2022.
Yeah.
Then the book appeared here.
I haven't actually received any. I would love to know what the reception is in Armenia. It's not an easy book. It's a wonderful book, I think, because I wrote the book, right? And it's an attempt to reinterpret what actually happened. In my understanding, I don't want to say it's Turks who did this. It's just because they're Turks. Their culture, their religion, whatever. These are violent people. They always hated Armenians. And I tried to emphasize different things. I emphasized that Armenians were not just victims, they were actors. They had members of parliament. They had intellectuals. Some of them were close friends of Talat Pasha. Grigor Zorab was playing cards in the English club with Talat Pasha. They had deputies in the parliament. They had revolutionary groups. They were actors, right? And they wanted certain things. First of all, I emphasized they were Ottoman subjects. They lived in the Ottoman Empire and they were loyal to the Ottoman Empire. They were not necessarily, no political party was active after 1908 in trying to create an independent state. The Turks said they were doing it. That was an accusation, but it actually wasn't true. They were ready to work, but they wanted better conditions under which to live. They wanted protection from predators, particularly from Kurds. They wanted greater self-rule, greater autonomy in their region. And they appealed to the West to get those protections. And those things were seen threatening to the young Turks, particularly to radical young Turks like Talat, Enver, and Cemal Pasha, right? And they developed a kind of mental view, an emotional view, which I call an affective disposition that saw Armenians as an existential threat to their power and to their empire. And therefore they turned to the most outrageous, dangerous, and actually destructive policy, even for themselves, namely genocide. So I wanted to emphasize that it was a contingent event. It was something that grew out of a long anti-Armenian feeling, but then metastasized during the war, World War I, into this genocidal mentality that led to the destruction of Armenians and Assyrians.
Yeah. 9 years ago, when it was the centennial of the Armenian Genocide, we did an interview, and I asked you also about the current state of Armenia diaspora relations. And you said that Armenia's problems are different from the diaspora problems. Armenia has serious security problems. It faces powerful enemies on its frontiers. Armenia is facing a tremendous danger, and the diaspora is concerned about that. But they have difficult understandings about how that problem might be solved. So it was before the 2016 war, it was before the 2020 war. So today, do you think that these understandings are still different, or today people in diaspora understand better the real problems that Armenia is facing? I mean, these existential threats.
I have no evidence for this, just anecdotal in a sense, living in the United States, that the diaspora is more interested in the diaspora nowadays than in Hayastan. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they've gotten used to the fact that Armenia exists, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed and Armenia became an independent state, at that moment, everyone was terribly enthusiastic. Oh, now we're independent, we can create our own lives, and so forth, right? And we can forget about the 70 years of Soviet power here. And nowadays they've gotten used to that, and they love coming as tourists. They're all thrilled. Movies are made about Armenia, etc. And yet the sense of the danger that Armenia is in is not as deeply felt in the diaspora as I think it should be, and as I feel it here once I'm here. There is no, if Azerbaijan decided to invade Armenia, it would be a disaster at the moment. I'm not sure how much defense there could be. People in Armenia are tired of war, and they're tired of conflict, and they want peace and security. They want to develop their lives. And think of the enormous talent here, that's available. You guys too, I'm amazed by the civil society and the talent here, and they want the ability to begin to develop that. So I wouldn't depend on the diaspora, but maybe a government could make, in Armenia, could make greater efforts to educate the diaspora, to link with the diaspora, to educate the diaspora in how important it is to preserve Armenia and what danger Armenia is in at the moment. So, I remember under the Soviets, there was some committee for relationships with Hayotun, right? Well, okay, so let's develop this more and maybe make sure you make those kinds of connections. Now, at the moment, it's difficult because the country is divided. And, the church is on one side, Pashinyan on another. There's opposition, there are demonstrations from Tavush and all of this stuff. So it looks a little chaotic from outside. And all the difficulties and complexities of this situation are badly understood outside. But it seems to me that effort should be made. Because what is Armenia's capital? Not Yerevan. I mean, what is its social and political capital? That it is the most energetic democracy in this region, right? It is an example of what can be in the South Caucasus. Imagine a government loses a war and loses Artsakh and is reelected. That the Armenian people did not turn back to the old mafias that had ruled it up to the time of the Velvet Revolution. That's extraordinary. That means there's a solid, though divided and contested, interest in preserving democracy in this little country.
And let's end with a philosophical question.
Oh, philosophical, okay.
Yeah, what it means for you being Armenian.
What it means for me.
Yeah.
I have to...
I'm asking this because you are the representative of so-called old generation of the Armenian diaspora.
Older, right? Yes.
Yeah. And I think that maybe your feelings have changed during the decades. But today, after this catastrophe, as you name it, what's the importance of being Armenian for you?
So I have to tell you a little of my background. Yeah. My grandfather, Grigor Suny, who was a composer from Getabek, Karabakh, and so forth, was a Dashnag up to the revolution. And then when he went to America and Armenia was Soviet, he became a Harajdimakan, which was basically a communist. And he supported this Soviet Armenia with as much as he could. He was diabetic, so he couldn't come back. But from Philadelphia, he did this. In 1937, my grandfather made a speech against Stalin, because of the purges, the destruction of the government led by Almatuni and so forth. And he was thrown out of the party and died a few years later, but still pro-Armenian, pro-Soviet, a Marxist, etc. And I grew up with this sentiment about that something good is happening in the Soviet Union. It's protecting Armenia, it's developing the country, etc. We know all the terrible horrors, particularly under Stalin, but there was this feeling. Even when many people in the diaspora said there is no Armenia, my family didn't say that. We were supporting. Okay, then Armenia became independent, and everyone was very happy. I was a little worried about that. I thought, how can it be independent in this very hostile neighborhood? There are great dangers. So I was always a little bit critical of what was going on, and also of the expansion of Armenia into areas outside of Karabakh. And rightly, people were very critical of my attitudes. Now, over these years, I am anti-nationalist. I am not a nationalist. I am a patriot. I love Armenia. I even love America, but I am always critical of America because I don't like their policies, right? And I think it's good to be critical and to say we'd like to do things better, right? On the other hand, and I also believe one more thing, I am what they're called in scholarship a constructivist. I believe that nations are imagined communities. They're not natural communities. They are ones in which people think they share something and therefore it becomes real. And once they imagine they're a country, a nation like Armenia, this Armenia is in existence. If they stop to believe that it exists, it will disappear. So that's important. And I'm anti-nationalist, right? I'm an internationalist. I don't believe we're better than anybody else, but I'm happy to be Armenian. I love the music, the food, the culture, all those things. But here's the problem. When I come to Armenia, as much as I think it's an imagined community and a choice for me to think of myself as Armenian, when I actually step off the airplane and I hear people speaking Armenian, I get chills. I get mirashki, Where did this come from? Why do I feel this way? Even though I grew up in America and I was not taught Armenian, I had to learn Armenia here 60 years ago while I lived in the Hanna Gatsaran on Mashtots, which was then Lenini Pogots, So there's something natural there. And I feel because Armenians have stopped calling me Davajan, and now they're interested in my work and the kind of scholarship we're doing, I feel even closer to the people of this country. And I suffer with it, and I suffer with the loss of Artsakh, and I'm angry at my other country, America, for not putting sanctions on Azerbaijan after that disaster.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.